We
Good morning and welcome to this symposium on the centrality of peripheral research and the pitfall of tight boundary gatekeeping. I'm Giovanna Michelone from the University of Exeter, and I have the task today to moderate this panel. But before I do so, I would probably set the mood with a little bit of an introduction to the topic of the symposium. Before I do that, though, I would like to thank you, the panelists, for making this possible today. I would also like to thank the scientific committee and the organizing committee of the EAA Congress here in Valencia for allowing us to discuss this topic with you today. And of course, thank you for coming here today with a kind of early morning given Spanish time. The first thing that I want to sort of talk with you about is the oxymoron that the title of this symposium has. And the oxymoron is really used because we want to stress the importance of conducting research away from the center of a discipline. However, when we think about moving away from the center, so when we think about boundaries and periphery, we really think about frontier research. So what is frontier research? It's about creating new knowledge and developing new understanding. So it's about theoretical innovation and empirical understanding of the phenomenon. It's about taking risky projects, risky endeavors, because the trajectory that will prove most fruitful is not known ex ante. It's also about creating new knowledge, but also creating useful knowledge. So it's about theory as much as about applied research. And then it's about going beyond the boundary of a discipline. So it's about multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary research. Now, I cannot say these elements that characterize frontier research are really my own. They come from a report of a high-level expert group that the European Commission put together back in 2005 when they started discussing a European-level funding mechanism to promote frontier research. However, given the topic of the symposium, talking about frontier research, talking about research at the periphery, means that we have to sort of discuss what we mean by accounting boundaries. And in fact, some of you may even wonder whether it is a necessary question. Do we really need to discuss about boundaries of accounting research? It's not an easy task, it's not obvious. When we think about accounting research, we think about research question, we think about the positioning in the literature, so the literature on which we draw, and we also think about the research outlets that we go for, the conferences, the journals. So which mix defines what we mean by accounting research? And maybe some of you have experienced a referee saying, where is the accounting? What is the accounting problem that you're tackling? Or maybe you as a referee have posed this question to unknown authors. Now, because of this question, what I'm going to try to do is provide you some examples that really don't want to prove anything, but just want to show you how much variety there is when we think about accounting research. So this is a paper that talks about executive gender pay gaps. And essentially they use a large-scale archival data set to document that one of the contributing factors to the executive gender pay gaps is essentially female risk aversion. They use ex-ante measures of compensation to essentially say females prefer to be on the safe side, and this decreases essentially their pays. They also see that there is a moderating effect for the gender diversity at the board level. So when there are more females in the board, this gap is decreased. Now, this paper is rooted in 3 streams of research. It's about executive pay differentials, it's about gender-specific risk preferences, and it's about board gender diversity. I thought, how can I give you a glimpse of this paper in a synthetic way? And so I decided to go for a keyword count. And I chose keywords that recall accounting and related research, picking up also disciplines that are close to accounting, so other business disciplines. If we look at the word count, we see that I really picked up the wrong words to describe this paper when we look at how many times these keywords appear in the text. However, if we look at how many times keywords like accounting, business, finance, organization, economics, and management and governance appear in the reference list, we have a glimpse about the kind of literature that the paper is drawing from. And it's pretty clear that this is a paper rooted in economics and finance literature. Now, this paper was just recently accepted in contemporary accounting research. The next paper is about the proliferation of online rankings that are based on peer reviews process. So essentially people use these rankings to express a judgment about certain things. These authors use the TripAdvisor case to understand how these rankings generate trust. And in their discussion, they eventually come to analyze how rankings and online reviews help generate trust, and they discuss the implication for the accounting profession and accounting research. What is particularly interesting of this paper is that what the authors are doing are essentially moving away from investigating an accounting practice. Instead, they look at the social phenomenon first and then draw implications for the accounting research and the accounting profession. So they start from very unsure waters, they move away from the center of the discipline, and then they bring it back. If we do a similar exercise and we look at the description using these keywords, we see that this is a paper that is more rooted in accounting literature, but also draws a lot from organization studies and management literature. And this was a paper that was published a few years ago in Accounting, Organization and Society. Then we have another paper, which is a normative paper, not something that we're really used to see a lot anymore. And they propose a new perspective on the responsibility of the public accounting profession. This research, this analysis, this critique comes really within the debate about whether the profession should get involved in developing standards for information, for reporting information to stakeholders rather than just investors and creditors, and it was motivated by a recent decision by the FASB to move actually in the opposite direction with respect to what the authors are arguing. And so in their discussion, they essentially challenge the shareholders' primacy assumption, and they use notions such as residual claims and implicit contract to prove their argument about accounting for stakeholders rather than just for the shareholders and the investor. Again, this is a paper that it's quite interdisciplinary in terms of the background literature it draws from, because obviously by discussing stakeholders, it refers to stakeholder theory, so there is a lot of management research in there, but it's also a critique of traditional finance theory. So we have a lot of reference to agency theory, for example. And then of course it's about accounting for stakeholders, which means that is an accounting paper. But, sorry, I went the other way around. Here we go. But what I think is really more interesting about this paper is that it was published in a non-accounting journal, in the Journal of Management Studies, and it was in fact part of a special issue about accounting for stakeholders. Okay, so this is saying that accounting research is not just being published in accounting journal. I have one last example, and this is a paper about professionalism in the accounting community. And essentially in this paper, the authors are examining what we mean by professional status, and they are essentially criticizing the use of a shopping list approach to define profession, because these attributes are not enough to distinguish between true, genuine professionals and imitators. And essentially, they say that these attributes, these shopping lists, are nothing but just symptoms that are not able to identify the critical conditions that we need to become a profession. And so they essentially argue that we need to shift the focus to the perception of the audiences before whom we want to become a profession in order to identify a right definition of profession. And so they propose what is known as an intimidation model, and essentially they say that the essence of a truly professional behavior is the capacity to intimidate whatever audience threatens a profession's autonomy. This does not mean that we should go around with weapons, but instead is saying that the profession essentially defends its position through cruciality of the matters for which the profession is needed in the eye of the audience, and through mystique, where mystique is about the expertise and technical knowledge and specialized training without which the matters and solutions would not be comprehensible. This paper was published in The Accounting Review in 1977. So, without really wanting to prove anything, but the idea of these four examples tell us that it is really not easy to discriminate the boundaries of accounting research and to decide what belongs or not to accounting research. Because accounting boundaries vary across journals at the same point of time. They also vary within the same journal over time. And in a sense, they go beyond accounting journals. Because of all of this, the objective of the symposium is really to have a discussion and debate about the boundaries of accounting research, and we will try to explore some of the questions that appear on the slides there. I am not really sure whether we will provide answers or answers that we can all agree about, but that's the intent of the symposium. And this question will be discussed together with our three panelists. So let me just give a brief introduction, and let's start with the ladies first. Michelle Rodrigue is an associate professor of accounting at Université Laval in Canada. Her research interests center around sustainability accounting with respect to disclosure and governance of sustainability performance and relation to stakeholders. Her work has appeared in Accounting Organization and Society, Management Accounting Review, Accounting Audit and Accountability Journal, and also the Journal of Business Ethics. Then we have Yves Chaudron, who is a professor of accounting also at Université Laval. He is highly committed to qualitative research, and his work focuses on the key features of public accountants' daily life in order to understand how accountants make and take decisions. And he also has widely contributed to a social critique regarding the extent of commercialization in the field of public accounting. His work has been published, among others, in Accounting Organization and Society, Auditing, a Journal of Practice and Theory, Contemporary Accounting Review, European Accounting Review, and also outside of accounting in the Journal of Management Studies and Organizational Studies. He is also the editor of Critical Perspective on Accounting, Associate Editor of Contemporary Accounting Review, and Auditing, a Journal of Practice and Theory. And then, last but not least, we have Thomas Jean-Jean, Professor of Accounting at SEC Business School, where he also serves as Dean for Executive Education. His research interests are in the area of financial reporting, earnings quality, accounting for research and development, corporate governance, and IFRS. His work has appeared in Accounting Organization and Society, Contemporary Accounting Review, European Accounting Review, and he has also published outside of accounting, especially in business studies, such as the Journal of International Business Studies and in the Journal of Business Ethics. He is also currently serving as the president of the French Accounting Association. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Yves and Michel, who will be our first presenter. Thank you very much.
Okay, buenos días. Okay, so thank you, Giovanna, for this very inspiring introduction. So we are going to talk about boundaries. The first point is that boundaries matter. You see, it's quite obvious in the way this room is set that there's a clear boundary between the speakers and the audience. It's obvious. Boundaries matter as well. We have been reminded of this in a quite unusual US election where one of the candidates promoted the idea of building a wall between Mexico and the US. We also claim that boundaries matter to the world of accounting research. And these boundaries are basically constructed, reconstructed every day through the big decisions and the small decisions we make as doctoral students, for instance, when we decide to work on this topic or to adopt this method instead of something else. As authors of papers, when we decide to work on a topic, when we decide to submit our work to this journal instead of another one. As editors or reviewers, when we decide to reject a paper or to send a revised and resubmit letter. Just to give you an idea, I'm co-editor-in-chief at Critical Perspectives on Accounting, and a few months ago we received, to my own surprise, an analytical modeling paper. So I thought at first, oh, that would be an easy decision. It will take me 30 seconds to desk reject it. Well, guess what? I read the abstract and I said, it sounds interesting. I then began to read the introduction, and there was something in it. It was critical to some extent. So basically, I then consulted my co-editors-in-chief, and then we all agreed that, yes, let us send it to review. So we found reviewers. We got the reviews back. The paper was ultimately rejected. But sometime after we sent the decision to the author got back to us saying that the comments that the reviewers provided were just great and he was very happy about it. So through the decisions we make every day, either as reviewers especially and editors, we impact the boundaries of accounting research. We impact the boundaries between what is good, what is less good research. So our objective, basically, and we are going to do it, Michel and I, as a team, given the proximity of our offices. So we thought that it would make sense to develop a joint presentation. And then, well, Thomas will be acting separately, providing a different viewpoint on the matter. Okay, so let's see how this operates. Okay. Okay, so the outline of our argument is here. So we want to take the time to reflect on something on which we don't usually take the time to reflect, which is the processes by which accounting research are socially constructed. Along the work of several other writers, we view work at the periphery of an area's research boundaries as having significant potential for the development of new ideas and innovations. However, and this is an important point, an excessively protective center may prevent these ideas and innovations from being brought into the field of visibility. So at the end of the day, ultimately, we believe that the longer-term sustainability of accounting research requires the incremental development of spaces of receptivity towards the unexpected and the peripheral. Okay, so accounting research, our presentation basically is structured around 5 key points. Okay, so the first point is here. First point, and it's quite in line with Giovanna's introduction. The first point is that accounting research boundaries vary in time and space. I think it's quite uncontentious. We also need to keep in mind the specific nature of accounting research, which is to study the accounting practice. So basically, the boundaries of accounting research to some extent will be impacted by the boundaries of accounting. Peter Miller in 1998 in European Accounting Review produced a very interesting paper on the boundaries of the practice of accounting. And some of the ideas he develops in this paper are quite useful. We can extrapolate them quite easily to the boundaries of accounting research. So here he claims that even though there are often fierce arguments and disputes when a new way of calculating is introduced, the malleability of accounting is quite remarkable. The criteria for what can count as accounting are historically contingent and temporarily stabilized. Accounting is riven with tensions as to its identity and its boundaries. So we have an interesting relationship here. So the boundaries of accounting and the identity of accounting, accountants, are involved in a kind of dynamics. It's the same thing we claim for accounting research. So the boundaries of accounting research, which are reproduced every day, basically have an impact on identities of researchers, of journals, etc. Our second point, research boundaries are socially constructed, so therefore they're produced by human beings. So they're produced by a range of actors, a range of influences, of forces. Among these actors, we find teachers, authors of papers, reviewers, editors. The ways in which accounting research boundaries are constructed these processes are conscious and unconscious. Okay, this is a basic assumption we have. And when we think about the producers of accounting research boundaries, well, we may use the word gatekeepers in order to qualify their work to some extent. So when we think about a research boundary, we have some security controls. So in the context of accounting research, we will call these people boundary gatekeepers. These gatekeepers tend to be preoccupied with, tend to have some key concerns in mind when they do boundary work, consciously or unconsciously. So one common question which is raised by reviewers, by editors when assessing a research paper submitted to a journal, for instance. The question is this accounting? For some people, they're quite clear in their mind what accounting is. For other people, the notion of accounting is quite malleable, flexible. Esamel and Hoskin, in a paper published in 2002, wonder that once an item is named and counted, then is it accounting? If we look at Mike Powers' classic book, The Audit Society, in which he claims that there's an audit explosion going on in society. If this idea makes sense, that auditing gets more and more implicated into the fabric of social life in diverse ways, in a range of ways, so then how can we be so sure that auditing is this and not this? But the key point is that, is this accounting? This question is often raised by reviewers and editors when deciding if a paper should be rejected or not. Another key concern that we often see in editorial letters, in reviewers' comments, relates to the extent to which a given research is in line with good research. Okay, so this is quite common. Another key aspect which is involved in boundary work relates to the notion of contribution. So quite often, when our work is rejected by journals, one of the key arguments relates to the paper's contributions, almost as if these contributions could be clearly defined, specified. Yet, this is not that obvious. In another paper which I wrote, well, I asked key questions on this notion of contribution, and I then argued that this notion is unstable, ambiguous, contradictory, relative. But again, the key point is that research gatekeepers tend to make decisions relying on these key questions. Is this accounting? Is this research in line with the criteria of goodness? And is there a contribution or not in this work? Okay, so it's now time to look at the third point of our argument, and then Michel is going to follow.
So, good morning, everybody. Moving on now to our third and fourth points, which I will touch together. Our intention here is to point out that the way we define accounting boundaries have significant consequences in different respects for individual researchers, for intellectual trajectories, and more broadly for practice and society as well. And we hope that you'll see that far from being independent, these consequences are interrelated, and that collectively they have a much bigger impact on the sustainability of accounting research than each of the consequences would have individually. So don't get us wrong, our point here is not to promote a world devoid of boundaries. As Yves mentioned at the beginning of his talk, I mean, we are in our endeavors, daily endeavors, we take part in the production of boundaries. No, our point, and we recognize as well that boundaries are useful to to create some kind of point of reference within a community. So our argument is more to target the detrimental consequences of excessive gatekeeping. So we're all about being aware and pay attention to the excesses and their consequences. Because tight boundary gatekeeping regarding the nature of accounting and regarding the nature of accounting research is likely to impoverish the research community over time. The first, maybe most obvious consequence that comes to mind when thinking about accounting research boundaries is having a paper rejected because it does not fit within the acceptable boundaries as enacted by the reviewers or the editors, rather than having a paper rejected because of fundamental flaw of the paper. Arguably, authors that are pursuing work that is more at the periphery of accounting will have a much harder time explaining, exposing, justifying how their work fits within the acceptable accounting boundaries than an academic who pursues work within the core center of the boundaries. Most of us in the room are aware of the range of consequences associated with a rejection. Emotional consequences, motivational consequences, but also the time and the energy that is required to start over the publication process with another journal. And there's also the non-neglectable consequences on promotion delays as well. So we suggest, in line with Moser, that depending on how accounting research boundaries are implemented and enacted, they are likely to generate too much waste, to use Moser's term, and unnecessary rejections. Accounting research boundaries can also have acute consequences for emerging scholars or junior scholars. And a vivid example of that is a paper by Marsh and Tessier, in which they conducted an autoethnographic study where they report their experience with the implementation in their own faculty of a new journal ranking system that was widely different from what they were used to. So this process, which is a process of boundary construction, lead them to attempt to shape their identity to fit within the newly implemented boundaries. And this had the consequence on them to reduce their research innovation and also to curb their work motivation. Another consequences it had was also to expose them to their departmental politics. And as junior scholars, they didn't have the political capital to get their point heard, and they felt like they have been thrown into departmental politics too soon. So deflecting research energy of tenure-track professors towards departmental politics, well, if we go back to Moser from the previous slide, this could be seen as another type of waste. Our more general point in this respect is that boundaries are performative. They generate fear of failure, pressure to publish, pressure also to conduct research in a certain acceptable way. And all these points toward the doctoral process being a venue where exploration and experimentation, which was traditionally encouraged, is now seen as risky. And the doctoral process is now more sometimes seen as a venue wherein junior scholars should undertake safer and narrower research projects. if we were to make a Foucauldian analogy, we could argue that tight boundary gatekeeping creates areas of visibility in our field and also leaves some areas in the shadows. And as indications of these areas left in the shadows, we've noted some reference to blind spots, elements being shunned, non-discussable, myopia, and insularity within accounting research. The elements that are being shunned or non-discussable relates to topics, to theory, method, contribution, even to some aspects of the nature of accounting itself. Arguably, of course, I mean, some elements that are being left in the shadow in one paradigm of research may be under the spotlight in another paradigm. However, we cannot be sure that what's left in the shadow here is under the spotlight over there. So there's no way to know the magnitude of the shadow that is overcasting our field. So beyond the importance of each element that is being shunned, for example, there is a broader concern that having such things as blind spots or insularity or myopia carries the risk of significantly affecting the way we understand accounting practice. We can also relate the definition of accounting boundaries to extremely significant consequences for the evolution of accounting research. The definitions and redefinitions of accounting boundaries can generate innovative, groundbreaking research. But at the same time, as Humphrey and Gendron remind us, defining and redefining accounting research can also lead to stagnation, lack of innovation, and conformity in the development, production, and publication of accounting research. Such concerns are not trivial because they can significantly influence the way in which the field of accounting research will evolve. And these concerns for stagnation and uniformity in the accounting field have been repeated by many scholars over the last 10 years. And these concerns are also transversal. They have been voiced by researchers evolving in very different fields, from capital market research to behavioral, interdisciplinary, social and environmental accounting, everywhere. Back in 2008, Upwood was already concerned about the stagnation and uniformity going on in the accounting field. And he mentioned that as a discipline, the sum of research articles that we generate as a group does not produce a wider, more substantive whole. So almost 10 years later, we can say that the situation has improved. Enacting tight boundaries will ultimately lead to look for research ideas within the acceptable research boundaries, the prevailing research boundaries. And this ultimately would lead to gap spotting as a strategy to pinpoint new research questions. And gap spotting simply means that you find your research idea by producing a marginal extension of prior work, rather than, say, look for a research idea based on new trends in accounting practices, or from emerging public policy debate, or from your own interest and passion. This gap spotting has been condemned repeatedly by Matt Salveson, for instance, in recent years, but also by many different accounting scholars. And Thompson here quite eloquently point out different issues associated with gap spotting. Among other things, he says, gap spotting accepts the received wisdom and does not challenge axiomatic assumption or disrupt belief structures. Gap spotting also perpetuates any error, myopia, and ignorance contained within a discipline. Kaplan also talks about gap spotting as generating a herding effect within academia with respect to research ideas. In the world of research in which we evolve in, filled with journal ranking, publication pressure, research assessments, it's sometimes easy to lose sight of the fact that accounting practice exists and that accounting plays a role in society, and that research plays a role in society as well. So another consequence of tight boundary gatekeeping is to lose sight or to reduce the relevance of accounting research to inform accounting knowledge and accounting practice. Guthrie and Parker share their concern for the relevance of accounting research by raising a simple but extremely evocative question. Are we in danger of getting better and better at measuring and researching what is less and less important? Or in other words, do we miss out on important and interesting research opportunities? The overpopulation of some accounting research topic is also indicative of a reduced relevance of accounting research to inform practice. For example, back in 2007, Hopwood was already questioning the need for another study on earnings management. More recently, O'Dwyer and Innerman questioned the need for another study on the determinants of social and environmental disclosure. Beyond their concern about the little chance to produce more informative knowledge on the matter, they also raise the issue that there are more important questions out there that are still unanswered. For example, about the disruptions in accounting practice that are going on right now, or the wicked problems associated to sustainable development. To conclude, Hines reminds us that academic discourse frequently functions as a stabilizer of society. Research of social facts plays the important role in society of objectifying, normalizing, and so perpetuating those facts and the interest and power relations which gives rise to them. So overall, the way we define accounting boundaries is likely to have consequences on practice and on society more broadly. That said, of course we recognize that the relationship between research and society is eminently complex. Now it's now time to leave the floor to Eve for a fifth point.
Okay, so accounting research boundaries are socially constructed by humans. These boundaries, once constructed, have important effects. They have important consequences. One of them being potentially to impact the extent to which we are innovative or not in a field. So our fifth point is as follows. So we claim that there is a need within accounting research communities, plural, to constrain attitude and behaviors that favor the impermeability of research boundaries. On the contrary, permeability of boundaries should be viewed positively as a condition of possibility that may foster innovation in the domain of accounting thought. So on the next 5 slides, we would like to raise a number of questions and items, food for thought, in order to make us think about how in the different decisions that we make every day, how we may perhaps become more receptive to different ideas. The first slide here includes a number of key questions. So instead of presuming that there's a clear boundary between research and periphery, well, Should we be more aware of the extent to which the periphery and the center communicate with one another? Does the center's sustainability depend on the generation of innovative ideas and practices, which initially and tentatively emerge at the periphery? One example in my paradigm relates to Foucauldian research. When this appears in 1986 and 1987 in the US, basically it was quite peripheral. But then over time, Foucauldian research became part of the center in the domain of interdisciplinary work. So the point is that what occurs at the periphery may be quite important. Another question, should the center be made and remade aware of the dangers that may ensue from excessive confidence in prevailing ideas? We need to keep in mind that the center is quite powerful. Powerful at what? Powerful at reproducing itself. Powerful perhaps at erecting boundaries that protect the core of the center. Finally, how can we establish an attitude of receptiveness to novelty within the center of a given academic discipline? Is there a need to consider reforms at the structural or individual level? Okay, then, how should we judge atypical or peripheral research? We provide here a number of questions or points in this respect. First of all, we need to recognize that the accounting practice is always in the process of changing. So the question, what is accounting, is not that obvious. For instance, this morning I was looking at KPMG's website, which by the way is very good in order to get inspiring ideas. I was just finding that KPMG is now involved in providing services in immigration laws. So they provide services on immigration. Okay, and we're talking theoretically an accounting firm doing it. Second point, readers of accounting journals may be interested by topics whose relationship with accounting is not that obvious, not that direct. One key example is CEO compensation, for instance. A number of accounting journals have published papers on this. The relationship with the domain of accounting in terms of debits and credits is not obvious, but it's been decided that accounting readers were interested in this. We need as well to cultivate a journal environment which is conducive to openness. It relates to the work of reviewers, editors. We have here a very good excerpt from Jekyll and Carter. A couple of years ago, they reflected on the nature of reviews. So basically, they promote the idea that when we review a paper from time to time, we should have a leap of faith into the author's work. When I review papers or when I make an editorial decision, I try to think about, well, of course we reject papers at critical perspectives, so we are involved in boundary work, but at the same time I try to keep in mind that, well, is this paper going to be the next Ball and Brown 1968? Or is this paper going to be the next Burchell et al. 1980? So I don't have a clear answer. I'm not sure about the decisions I make, but at least I have this aspect in mind. We need as well to be aware of the limitations of our own paradigms, and that it's kind of unfair to assess a paper relying on another paradigm. At the end of the 1990s, I remember that I wanted to go to the auditing section of the EEE. So there was a conference, and I wanted to go there. So I submitted my papers to this conference, which were quite obvious rejected by people who evaluated my work through positivist criteria. So I was looking at the comments, and basically they were useless. So I did not go to these conferences, unfortunately, but I was able to publish these papers anyway in journals which were more receptive to these kinds of ideas. We need as well to recognize that an object of study may be studied through diverse angles, an infinity of angles and metaphors which may be mobilized in order to make sense of accounting and auditing. Okay, and finally, we need to be careful regarding the excesses of rigor. Research, I think, and a number of people claim it is as well, is subject to a tension between tradition, rigor, and novelty. And our point is that if we put too much strength on rigor, then we decrease novelty. So we need to ensure that there's a kind of balance between the two forces, tradition and novelty. Okay, I think it was my last slide. Yes, okay, so Michel is going to conclude in a few minutes.
Okay, so I'll make that quick to leave some time for Thomas to contribute to the discussion. So basically, we contend that excesses in gatekeeping may be detrimental to the sustainability of accounting research, and that we suggest that the accounting research domain is more likely to be vibrant and inspiring if it's kept under a degree of healthy tension between gatekeeping and the traveling of ideas. And each one in the room, in all of the roles that we play as academics, teachers, reviewers, editors, authors, members of funding committee, need to keep that in mind and to try to keep the undertaking of accounting research under a degree of healthy tension. In short, instead of seeking to erect tight protective boundaries around research and to constrain heavily the immigration of ideas, we believe that the world of research will be richer if pluralism is favored. And this is important for individual researchers, for intellectual trajectories, more broadly for practice in society, but it's also important for future generations of researchers as well.
Thank you very much to Michel and Yves while Thomas sets up this presentation. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm sure that Thomas will come up with some interesting comments if he's able to open up his presentation.
So, always typos on presentations.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning. I'm supposed to be the bad guy in that presentation because I'm supposed to strongly disagree with Yves and Michel. So I will try to be the accounting Trump, and trying to protect boundaries. Well, basically, if I try to summarize Yves and Michel's argument as I understand it, they make 3 points. First one is that too protective boundaries may limit innovation in the accounting field. Second, this excessive protection from the center has some adverse consequences on us as individuals, as academics, on our intellectual trajectories, but also on our institution and on the relevance of what we do and what we teach. And finally, the call for a loosening of the tight boundaries, and they make a call for having more, well, what's it called, immigration of new ideas, which is an expression I like. Well, basically, it's difficult to disagree with all those arguments, but I will try to. So first, I won't try to challenge two things. The first one is that innovation comes and occurs from the periphery and from a transdisciplinary approach. This is something that I won't even try to challenge because I fully agree with this notion. The second point is that definitively accounting as an academic discipline needs to be more relevant. Well, basically, who cares about what we do research on? And I think that's also a point that I won't try to challenge because it would be, well, it won't be good for my mood, at least. So I won't try to challenge that. What I would try to challenge is on how is it possible to loosen a little bit this tight gatekeeping. As far as I understand, Yves and Michel's point is that they call for changes at the journal level, from the editors and from the reviewer. And I'm not sure that I agree with that, because I think that it's extremely difficult to ask a reviewer who is absolutely ignorant about Foucault to assess and to welcome a paper using a Foucauldian approach. It's quite difficult for an editor to welcome a research on a paper on a topic that it does not even understand. Rather, I think that there is a risk, of accepting non-quality papers because just you are ignorant about that field. However, I think that we should maybe more concentrate on the other gatekeepers that also create boundaries. To summarize the rest of my presentation, and I will try to keep it short to have time for discussion. Well, they had 5 points, I have 5 steps, and you see the difference. That's really major. My first point is that I would like to go back on the importance of research. Why is it important to do research in accounting? And I think that this point deserves probably attention. Second, I will try to show that this importance of research that is socially constructed creates a need for gatekeeping. And those gatekeepers are really important. I think that most of us, because we are all gatekeepers, we do this job in fairness. And I think we do our best. And from time to time, as Yves and Michel said, by doing our best, we do harm our discipline. And this is my third point, I will fully recognize that there are limitations in gatekeepings, but however, it is absolutely necessary to have gatekeepers. And then I will try to see how we can look at other gatekeepers, and I will try also to suggest other ways, to generate new ideas and more relevance of academic accounting research. So step number one, why do we need research? Well, basically, as we all know, historically, research is not really natural from a business school perspective. A long, long time ago, there was no research in accounting, no research at all in business schools, and it worked perfectly well. So basically, this market for accounting and for business research in general was really socially constructed. And basically, this demand was created in the late 50s, early 60s. So I wasn't even born, like most of us here. But basically, you had 2 influential reports in the US. It's 2 reports commended by 2 foundations, the Carnegie Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Okay, so that's the Pierce report and the Gordon-Orwell report. Well, basically, those reports try to analyze the state of business education at that time in the US. And basically, after reviewing all the programs that existed for something like 60 or 70 years, ago from that time. They observed that 60% of the teaching staff of business schools at that time in the US did not have a PhD. Okay? And rather the teaching staff was a mix of former graduates from those schools, so pure practitioners, and academics from other schools, economics, philosophy, and so on, that has a very distant interest with business. And at that time, accounting research was mostly normative, okay, meaning observing, categorizing accounting practices or suggesting new rules and regulations. And basically, they decided to call for a system where professors in business school should have a PhD, should do research, and should be assessed not only on the quality of teaching, but also on the quality of their research. Okay? And those two reports were massively influential in the US and then in the rest of the world to shape the demand for research in business administration as we know today. So this research was really socially constructed. One important point is that in 1984, Orwell declared that business school managers should not care that much about practitioners, but much more about research. Why? Because research will give indications about what will happen in the future, whereas current managers will tell you about the current state of the affairs and not about what will happen in the future. And so basically those two reports were massively supported by massive funding and so on, and so they created the business schools or the business entities as we know now. Basically the first consequence is that you had a huge increase in the number of PhDs, from 150 in the 60s to more than 1,500 nowadays. Okay? And the number of PhD granting institutions in business fields, well, basically were multiplied by something like 3 or 4 in the last 40 years. So you had a massive increase in this demand and supply of PhDs. If we narrow to the accounting field, in beginning of the 60s, you had 2 accounting journals, the Accounting Review plus a UK one. Okay? According to ZEF 96, you have more than 77 now accounting outlets that are listed somewhere. So you also have a huge increase in the number of outlets. We also know that rankings now give a significant weight on research. If we look at the Financial Times ranking, which is prominent in Europe, for instance, when you rank MBAs, 20% of the rank is given by the research productivity of the researchers in a list of 45 journals. And basically, those 2 reports led to what Chua called the NIRD, New, Innovative, Rigorous, Defensible Research. Well, basically that's an economic-based research based on developing theory and then testing that theory with quantitative methods. Well, we all know that this development of research led to a number of consequences. The first one is that you had a decoupling between research and practice. I guess that probably most of the papers that are discussed in this conference will just appear as something bizarre to accounting practitioners. Okay, so the link between practice and theory now is very loose. Second, we all know that in our evaluation, there is an importance of the number of publications and the quality of the outlets in which we publish. It's much more important to see how many top publications you have rather than what you wrote into those journals. Third consequence is that you have a domination of economics. Okay? Basically, most of the mainstream research is econ-based. And the fourth consequence is that you have a tight control over a small number of persons over accounting academia. Okay? They come from a limited set of institutions, and this is a fact that is well documented in the literature. Well, those consequences, however, have to be somewhat nuanced in the sense that you have a recent, not so recent, 10 years now, you have papers. I cite one by Fogarty and Liao documenting that in the accounting review, basically, you have more diversity in the editorial board than before. Okay, so things are changing slowly, but things are changing. Let's be optimistic. Second point is that outside the US, research traditions are much more diverse than in the US. I mean, I did not have time to make the count, but if I look at presentations, let's say at the EAA conference, usually it's much more balanced than, let's say, to AAA conference, for instance. So there are also some geography matters to assess the notion of boundaries and center. And basically, even if what is considered the three top journals, okay, JE, Accounting Review, and JAR are really econ-based, you also have a number of high-quality outlets that are also much more open. AOS, of course, CAR is also a good example. So there are non-mainstream journals, or they welcome also non-mainstream papers, and you also have specialized outlets on non-mainstream papers. So basically, the view is not black and white. I mean, you have a lot of gray in between. So basically, this is why we need research. Basically, the need is created. Now we are in a system where basically we have to publish research, right? So there is no escaping. So this situation creates a need for gatekeeping. Well, because basically we need to, you have a huge supply of research, and of course you have to filter and you have to also improve the quality of research, and this is part of the review process, and this is part also of the gatekeeping process. And so basically we need gatekeeping to assess ideas, okay? And then the system was a little bit tweaked, because now we use gatekeeping to assess promotion and tenure, okay? So we move from assessing ideas to assessing people and counting bins, basically how many publications do you have. And basically there are a lot of gatekeepers. Okay? First, we need gatekeepers to rank reviews. Okay? Who decided that publishing a paper in Accounting Review is more prestigious than publishing a paper in European Accounting Review? Okay? Somebody decided that you have top papers. Okay? Second, you have performance benchmarks. Usually over lunch or over coffee, we discuss about tenure cases in our institution, say, okay, how many papers do you need to have tenure? Okay, so you have some performance benchmarks. Third, we need to assess performance. Okay, oh, I don't have a paper in Accounting Review, but I have 2 in CAR. Is it equivalent, yes or no? Okay, you have some leeway. How do you assess that? We also need gatekeepers, of course, to appoint editors and editorial boards. And, of course, you have gatekeepers when you appoint a reviewer. Okay? So you have a series of gatekeepers. My point is that even Michel, from my understanding, mostly considered on the last 2 gatekeepers, but there are also other ones that, in my view, will have a much stronger impact on setting the boundaries. So we need gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is absolutely necessary, and we know that it is perfectly imperfect. Okay? But basically, we have to live with that. Basically, it's necessary. Why? Because it provides an external assessment of research. Okay? When I draft a paper, I think it's a good paper. Okay? But of course, it's with discussion with people that I will improve the paper, and it will be recognized as a good or as a not so good paper based on decision of others. Okay? So we need that because that's an external quality assessment. Second, nowadays with social media, repository like SSRN, open access resources, we have a lot of resources. Okay? So basically we need gatekeepers. If not, we'll be overwhelmed with information. Most of this information will be probably irrelevant. And third, that's also very efficient. Okay? If not, each institution will have to create their own gatekeepers. So here we externalize, in a way, gatekeeping to others. Of course, gatekeeping is by nature imperfect. Okay? There is an interesting paper by Siller et al. Okay? So basically, they provided an inspection of gatekeeping in medicine. The nice thing with medicine is that you can see if the paper is good or bad because it will lead to a drug, and you will see if this drug saves life or not. Okay, so they have an external benchmark to assess the quality of the filtering process, of the review process. Basically, their conclusion is that on average, reviewers do a good job in selecting good and not so good papers, but, and the but is important, they miss some important innovation. Okay, that's a human technology, so you have failures. Okay? We all know the famous examples of the Watson-Zimmerman papers or the Ball and Brown papers that were first rejected before becoming seminal papers, as we say. It's quite a bizarre expression. And of course, we all know that if you are very innovative, if you are very disruptive, then of course you have a higher risk of being rejected. Okay? So probably you have a trade-off between being innovative and being in line with previous research just to reassure your reviewer. So that's always a tight element. And of course, that's imperfect. So we need gatekeeping, but it's imperfect, and we have to live with that, I guess. So what about accounting? Well, basically about accounting, that's a complete disaster. Okay? If you look at the number of papers published by accountants versus other business disciplines, it's much lower. You have this famous paper by Swanson, 2004, showing that accountants publish less than in marketing, finance, and so on. And fortunately for us, and fortunately for schools, the salary of an accountant is much higher than for marketing and management, and we publish less. Okay? That's not so good. And if we look at the output, you have the AAA report that dates back from the early 90s. Okay? So I don't suspect AAA to be full of non-mainstream researchers. But basically, they say, well, basically, accounting research does not lead to practice or policy making. There is no innovation. There was no new fundamental issues brought into the accounting field over the last 20 or 30 years. And finally, there is no demand for academic accountant. Okay? So basically, the situation is quite catastrophic. So should we leave the room right now? Because basically nobody cares, okay, about accounting. No, I don't think that we should leave right now. Well, basically, gatekeeping, you have the individual values of the reviewers. Then you have also an organizational dimension. And I think that papers are not sent randomly to papers. I mean, if I write an earnings management paper using quantitative methods, it's unlikely I would send it to CPA. Okay? So basically, you have these organizational elements that count. And we also know that gatekeeping is dependent on institutional and social environment. And so basically, I think that academic institutions at large, not only us in that room, but also deans, they have a special responsibility to promote pluralism. So let me develop those points in a few minutes. Well, as we know with the sophistication of research, well, basically, papers are more and more sophisticated in terms of methodologies, in terms of samples, in terms of theory. Okay? Maybe 30 years ago, you only had papers with US data. Now you have papers with data from bizarre countries like China, Russia, or Europe, or Africa. So that's new and institutional settings that we have to discover as reviewers, so it requires more expertise. So of course, for an editor or reviewer, when you receive a paper using a new methodology, a new sample, a new topic, well, of course you don't know, okay? And we all know that when you don't know something, our first reaction is to reject, okay? Because we don't feel at ease. And that's quite a human, behavior that we have to limit, but that's how we behave, okay? So this is the first point, is that by definition, it's difficult to ask reviewers to assess a paper on a topic they don't know or using a methodology they don't know. Second point is that authors, they know exactly the journals, okay? So you don't send your papers randomly, okay? And basically, you have this trade-off between quality and specialized outlets, okay? Probably the most prestigious journals are generalist. And then if you cannot reach a top generalist journal, then you would go to a specialist outlet. And if you are rejected, then you will go to a second-tier generalist journals, okay? So you have this trade-off between talking to many people, but then you have to be of wider interest. If your paper is seen as too narrow, then you move to a specialist journal. So you have this author strategy, and I think that it's not only the responsibility of the journal editors and reviewers, it's also the responsibility of authors to be clever in the way they submit papers. And basically, you also have this QR model, that's provided by Ellison. It's discussed in Swanson 2004. Basically, they say to have a good paper, you have two dimensions. You have the quality of the paper, and then you have the quality of the review process, okay? And that's the interaction of the two that creates a good paper. So basically, we all know that some journals they want to have a big Q paper, meaning already a high-quality paper. And you have some other journals where you know that even if your paper is not so good, you will have positive reviewers that will help you to increase the quality of your paper. So you can have a small Q paper, but there is a big R, okay? They will give you a lot of feedback, okay? And so basically you have a kind of trade-off between Q and R that is socially constructed. And I reinterpret what even Michel said, is that in accounting, we should expect lower Q and bigger R. Okay, so basically they expect more from the review process than what we have already today. And having published in management journals, I must say that, I mean, this is quite surprising to see how positive might be the feedback that you receive from a management journal, even if your paper is rejected. Whereas in accounting, even if your paper is accepted, you will get nasty comments. So that's probably something cultural on which we have to work out a little bit. Okay? So basically, having this loosening gatekeeping, to me, is very difficult to implement. Because as an editor, if you are, let's say, mainstream, it's very difficult to identify who are the good associate editors, who are the good reviewers. It's not impossible. Some journals like CAR do that. But it's very complicated. Okay? And basically, there is also a risk that if you don't select good reviewers, maybe you will lower the quality of what is finally accepted. Basically, there are another point that maybe competition between journals is something that is important. Maybe if we say that you have two good outlets, let's say Accounting Review and AOS, okay, and then maybe competition can take place not within a journal, but between journals. Yes, I have to hurry up. Okay. Important point also is that the notion of periphery is absolutely moving. If you think about CSR or the role of institutions, it was originally something from the periphery that was then incorporated into the center. Now you have papers on the role of CSR or the role of institutions with a different meaning. I do agree, but still, you have the same idea in mainstream journals. So basically the notion of center and boundaries in research is something which is moving, which is a big difference, let's say, with a frontier between the US and Mexico, which is most likely to be stable. In research, hopefully, we have some moving centers and moving boundaries. And finally, academic institutions matter because basically we do not have to bear the weight of the mistakes of business school managers. Basically, our schools create the list, okay, and they say what is good research, what are the good outlets, okay. It's up to them, and of course we have to feed them, to set what are the criteria for good quality, okay. When we belong to evaluation committee, do we count publications or do we read the papers? I would love to say that I read the papers, but I don't, honestly, because I don't have time or because I don't know if it's something on the field I don't know. Okay? But basically, I think that there is also a special responsibility in the definition of the center, not only of the accounting academia, but also of our broader environment. And I think that there is a special responsibility of that. So basically, my point is that should we promote competition within journals by setting the play field of what are quality journals, not only mainstream but also other journals, or should we try to instillate, let's say, a Foucauldian approach into the Journal of Accounting and Economics? Okay? I think that probably promoting diversity in journals is a much more powerful way to promote pluralism. To conclude, I would like to thank even Michel and Giovanna for having the opportunity of thinking about the notion of plurality in research, because it's a notion on which we don't think carefully that often. And I'm sure that if we go back to the substance of why we do research, is that to do some relevant things, to have fun also, and not only to accumulate publications. And I think that we will radically change the play field. But it's less a question of local gatekeepers, editors and reviewers. I think to me it's much more an institutional challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we have about 10-15 minutes to open the discussion to the floor. If there are questions, I think a lot of comments that they give were provocative, so I'm sure you will have more questions rather than answers to the question they posed. There is a question right there, if we could give a microphone. Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much. I am Giuseppe Galassi, University of Parma, Italy. First of all, I thank you very much for your presentations and for the big problem you raised in this symposium. Our fundamental problem for accounting development, for accounting strengthening, but I should say also for accounting survival. The problem of research is not limited, of course, to the practical problem as the journal acceptance of papers from young generation and so on. Big problem. But the object of the research goes beyond these technicalities and these journals accept or not of the papers. I quite agree that it's necessary to go from the center to the periphery of accounting, just for innovation, just for strengthening and so on. But I should say it's not sufficient to be inside the boundaries. It is absolutely necessary, in my opinion, to go outside in neighboring disciplines, like economics and sociology, ethics, epistemology, and so on and so forth. And the main reason is that if we limit ourselves inside accounting, we can't understand the reality and we cannot predict the reality. For instance, all the accounting scandals all over the world, both in the States, in Europe, everywhere, depending just of the limited vision, of the reality, through the accounting lens only. As a matter of fact, the third speakers mention also a different research tradition in continental Europe. What it happens in continental Europe, in Italy, in Germany, especially in Netherlands, in the 20th century, accounting became business economics, because living inside the boundaries of accounting was just impossible to understand the reality, So accounting became business economics, which a wider discipline which deals with not only accounting, but economics, politics, anthropology, morality, epistemology, and so on and so forth. The reality is not only built by accounting, but we have different facets, different aspects. We must consider all these aspects, otherwise it's impossible to predict, to control the reality, so to live in this world. So I am quite favorable in enlarging the accounting research, but not only from the center to the periphery, but to go beyond in the neighboring disciplines. Since forever, illuminated authors in accounting field, I should say also from Anglo-Saxon world, said that it's very useful that our the mind is a little bit erratic. This was said since a long time ago and is much more valuable nowadays. This is my modest opinion. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Galassi. Do you want to comment briefly on the observation?
Thank you for your comment. I tend to agree with the point you raised. In fact, in my area of research, social and environmental accounting, there's been these talk about how we need to go outside of accounting and consider more sustainable science research to bring in the multidisciplinary perspectives that are necessary to take into account the issues related to social development that are obviously not only confined within accounting. So, thank you.
Any more questions? Philip? Oh, and Michelle. Michelle first and then Philip. Okay. No, Philip, the other way around.
Philip O'Regan from the University of Limerick in Ireland. Could I just ask Thomas a question? I was hoping, Thomas, you might bring the conversation to talk about the role of accreditation bodies, who seem to me to have a huge impact on how our discipline is framed and what's counted and what matters. I don't have a specific question on that, but could you maybe just say just make a comment or two about what you see as the role of accreditation bodies in the critical accounting space and how we could actually take advantage of them?
It's about accreditations, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that there are two things. If we look at accreditation, so there are national accreditations. So on that, it's difficult to comment. I just can comment on French accreditation. We tend to consider research as something important, but basically they are pure bean counters. Okay, so they require for each academic to qualify as a researcher to have 2 papers within 4 years. okay, irrespective of the quality of the paper. So you have a journalist, if you have 2 papers on that list, then you are considered as a researcher, as an active researcher, okay, which is completely stupid. I'm sure that probably France has a gold medal in stupidity. I'm sure that we can find other countries with similar rules. That basically, there is no search for relevance, there is a search for quantity. Now, if we look at transnational accreditations like ASCSB accreditations or EFMD, EQUIS accreditation, then to my knowledge, they require institutions to set their own performance standards. So basically, it's not driven by an external reference. It's each institution have to create its own reference. So I think that this, perspective is much more important because basically it gives importance to institutions to define what is good and bad research. And as we all know, when we talk about transdisciplinary research, everybody is in favor, in principle. Now, because it's very difficult to publish, many persons are reluctant to do transdisciplinary research. So basically, I think that the ASCSB or the EQUIS approach are really good because institutions have to wonder, okay, what is good research for me as an institution? Okay, now, of course, you have national standard setters that may create additional noise.
Does it work? Okay. Yes, good morning. Thanks very Michel Magnan. Thanks very much for interesting presentations, I think, which actually are complementary to some extent. I have a question with respect to what was said, but it's kind of a general question, and I'll preface it with some observations. In terms of research and the role of research, I teach a doctoral seminar, and sometimes when I prepare my lecture, I talk with my wife, who happens to be a management professor, and I show her some of the papers I'm reading, and she said, "Oh, boring. We did that 10 years ago, 15 years ago in management." Often, also as an editor, I would see papers in accounting which basically did not cite very relevant research. You were talking about boundaries, but very relevant research in other fields. Like we seem to be somewhat inward looking, and we create our own boundaries to some extent willingly and not be aware of knowledge outside. So that's one observation. Second observation, my daughter is in psychology, and even in her first year at the bachelor level, she gets exposed to research extensively, and she knows authors. And you look at the other fields as well, research is prevalent even in undergraduate studies. And if you contrast that with accounting, it would appear that there's kind of a frontier between, I think in many respects, between our research, what we do in our research world, and what happens in the classroom. And if you look at professional accountants, the knowledge they have of accounting research would be abysmal in terms of even non-existent to some extent. And I think it relates to what you were talking about, the role, the relevance of research. And I think even we're maybe our own worst enemies to some extent. I would like your comments on this view, because for me, if you look at if there's a future in accounting research to make it relevant, it needs to start where we have some control, that is the classroom. And what are we doing in that respect? Thank you.
Okay, I will try to provide an answer, but I'm typically not very good at improvising. These are good comments, Michel. In terms of the notion of relevance, I think it's a very good point, and we need to keep this in mind in order to better understand the impact of these boundaries and how they are making. And your point about teaching and the boundaries between research and teaching, and that we are indeed creating these boundaries ourselves is deeply right. Although it varies from discipline to discipline. In auditing, for instance, well, in the courses that I teach, I tend to rely to some extent on research. But I'm aware that in some other fields, such as financial accounting, the boundaries are quite tight, usually. Unfortunately, I think that our students would benefit extensively from being exposed to the world of research, to the domain of ideas. This would probably stimulate their reflexivity as future professionals. But for reasons which we cannot address within 10 seconds, the institutions of teaching in business schools are not really, at least in North America, are not really favorable to this, unfortunately. So I don't know what, is there something else you would like to add?
I may just want to add, maybe it's because accounting is not just a discipline, but it's also a profession. So when it comes to going to the classroom, we have to provide that mystique and cruciality of the issues that we do, because we are teaching to professionals that want to become a profession, and this is not taking away the problem that accounting research does not look at relevant questions, but maybe we have a double source when it comes to going to the classroom a little bit, because we have to transfer that technical expertise that will be needed for whoever doesn't want to be a researcher. So, yeah.
Maybe just one point. I mean, I do agree with you, Michel, and probably it's also related to the fact that accounting is, I would say, we are dominated twice. I mean, on the teaching dimension, I will speak for France, but I'm sure it's also the case in other countries, that we don't have a monopoly over teaching accounting. We also have many external lecturers, and many of them are CPAs. So basically, we have our own legitimacy, but they also have their own legitimacy. So basically, teaching-wise, we have to compete with those professionals. So basically, to do that, we have to mimic them to some extent. And then research-wise, we know that we have the competition from finance or business economics, if you belong to the so-called mainstream. You have the competition from sociologists or historians, if you belong to the so-called non-mainstream. And so basically, we also have to be on par with those competing disciplines. And so basically, we have to compete twice. And basically, if I understand well your point, that we are losing twice on both dimensions, instead of each dimension reinforcing the other. But probably for teaching, I think one possibility is that we don't do that, not because it wouldn't be beneficial to our students and participants, but just because we do not control exactly what is said, because we have to comply with local regulations to become a CPA, and because we are not the only one to teach in the classroom.
But then again, I think it goes back to the fact that research is not relevant enough for practice. Because if research was relevant for practice, then we would not be in competition with the profession to set the content in our classrooms, because it would be more natural to include some research because it would seem relevant to the profession.
Just a quick comment on this. I wonder about the extent to which practice is interested about relevant research. What is relevance, etc.
Thank you. I think we already are a little bit late in perfect Italian style. So if you have any more questions, I encourage you to come and talk to the panelists during the coffee break. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.